If everyone can try to take your seats, please. Thank you, everyone, for coming if you just arrived, or for sticking around after this morning's panel. We're going to have two brief presentations before we begin the second panel, beginning with the Dean of the Law School, who has been kind enough to come here to make a brief remark welcoming you all. And so I would like to present to you Dean Mark Grunwald.
Thanks, Sam. I can see from some of the faces in the audience that I don't need to welcome you to Washington and Lee. You're quite here already, and I see some returning faces from years past at Washington and Lee. But it is a great pleasure not only to have you at Washington and Lee, but at the law school at Washington and Lee, and to have you here for this symposium, which looks to me, I missed the morning and I'm afraid I'm going to have to miss the afternoon, but it looks to me like a terrific program. I mean, we have people here who are leaders in government, academia, in the business world, and the topics that you're considering couldn't be more important. I want to, though, primarily express some appreciation I have. I certainly have it for those of you who are visitors here participating in the program as guests, but to the folks who made this happen, and that is the students of the journal and the advisor to the journal, Professor Jill Fraley. It takes an awful lot of work to put a program like this together, and this particular journal has had a long voyage to this point, and I think we're at a point that we're particularly proud of its work. That is, if I remember back 10, even 15, 20 years ago, what is now this journal was a newsletter that the students helped publish for the Virginia Bar Association section on environmental law. It's grown and expanded over the years to the state that it's reached today, able to put on a symposium of this scope, of this importance, and with this level of participation. It's terrific for the law school, and the credit really all goes to the students, and we'll give a little credit to Professor Fraley, and even prepared to give a little credit to Professor Fairfield, Director of the Law Center, who's always behind the symposia that we put on the law school. So, welcome. I know it was very interesting this morning. I expect it'll only get more interesting this afternoon. It's good to have you here, and you're always welcome back. Thank you.
We concur about the value and the importance of having this journal provide a forum for discussing energy, climate, and environmental law with a national and international audience here at the Appalachian Front, with a strong anchor in the Appalachian region. This is a critical place to be having these conversations. The issues that we've discussed this morning, and certainly the issues that we discussed this afternoon, are kind of cosmically important, not to overstate things, in the future of federal climate law, sorting out the tensions in federalism under the environmental statutes and under the state laws in these industries that we're going to be discussing shortly, is, as you all know, and I'm not going to explain, is immensely important politically, legally. And we're very honored that this journal is providing this forum here today with these people. Part of the importance of having this discussion is that it's connected not just to the legal academy, but to the real world. And we've been honored to have received an offer from Dr. Tony Smith, the CEO of Secure Futures, which is the project developer that has installed now the largest solar array in the Commonwealth of Virginia on the roof of this building and across the creek there. He's putting all this theory into practice, and it's good to have this voice. He's going to make a brief presentation about his project, where they fit in, and I just learned that Dr. Smith had also been involved with the, I believe I'm correct to say, the first major microcredit program that in the state of West Virginia that received a Community Development Financial Institution grant, doing important work on making renewable energy and making alternative economic development happen in Appalachia. We're honored to have him here, and I'd invite you to come up and make some brief remarks before we get into this panel.
Thank you. It's truly an honor to speak here and to speak under this roof, which, as Sam mentioned, is powering all the lighting and HVAC today with 1,016 solar energy panels from one of what we know as the most reliable, plentiful, and cheapest source of energy known to the human race, and that's the sun. It's a source of energy that is not subject to acts of terrorism, nor is it subject to 100-year earthquakes, as we noted in Virginia. It's not subject to three 500-year floods that we experienced in West Virginia a few years ago. And it's not subject to falling limbs on electric lines. It is subject to cloud factor. However, on an annualized basis, it is the most plentiful and reliable source of energy we know. So I'm pleased, I'm honored to be here to speak about our experience about developing a solar project here. I will say that developing solar power in Virginia is subject to one great uncertainty, and that is the legislative and regulatory environment. So we can withstand terrorism and earthquakes, but not regulators and legislators. We were halfway through building this project under a power purchase agreement with Washington and Lee. We signed the agreement on August 8th. On something like September 22nd, we received in the mail our first letter from Dominion Power with a cease and desist order that we were infringing on their exclusive territory as a utility provider for providing retail electric. We had thought we were covered because we had developed a power purchase agreement with a municipal utility in Harrisonburg the year before, which was then the largest. And we have in writing documentation that they consulted with Dominion and got their blessing as their supplier to proceed with the power purchase agreement. So we thought all was fair and was covered under the existing regulations. So needless to say, Washington and Lee has strengthened its visibility in the halls of the legislature. Not only because of the tremendous education and resources represented in this building, but because of this event, which became a cause célèbre in the solar field. And I have Ivy Main, Vice Chair of the Sierra Club, to thank for her Washington Post op-ed piece. And I want to also call out Eric Curran, our Chief Marketing Officer. Thank you both. In any case, W&L's name has become well known in the halls of the legislature, and for better or for worse, it has also been associated with the other three words, cease and desist. We immediately had to respond to this order by seeking legal counsel, and we did. And together with W&L, we sought counsel, informal counsel from the State Corporation Commission. Their lawyers advised us that we were on the right side of the issue in terms of interpreting the Virginia Code 56577, for those of you who are interested, paragraph 5A, which states in 9 words that an electric customer is able to purchase electric energy provided 100% from renewable energy from any supplier of electric energy licensed to sell retail electric energy within the Commonwealth. We obtained our license, but where there was a difference in opinion was whether if we were not only providing 100% from renewable energy, whether we had to provide 100% of W&L's electric supply, which by common sense would be kind of an absurd point, but nevertheless it's sufficiently vague. And we realized quickly, after filing our action for declaratory judgment, that we were going to be tied up for years, and we were halfway through construction, had a window, very narrow window in which to complete and finance the project. Together with W&L, we decided to withdraw the declaratory action and seek a legislative solution. And I'm pleased to inform you that Delegate Terry Kilgore from Coal Country in Southwest Virginia and chair of the House Commerce Committee sponsored a piece of legislation that would allow net meter PPAs in Virginia up to 500 kilowatts. It has passed the House 97 votes to 0. We understand from our friends in the utility industry that they are informing us that they will kill it in the Senate. Not that they plan to, but that it will be killed. Anyway, it comes before the Senate Commerce Committee on Monday. I would invite you to follow it. It's House Bill 129. And we understand that it'll be a challenge, but we're encouraged by the fact that more than 20 other states have adopted PPAs, including states with in regulatory, which are regulated. Not coincidentally, Virginia is near the bottom of states in the country in terms of solar development. I just want to share, on the bright side, a few words from President Russo to all members of the Senate Commerce Committee, and I'll just read one sentence. Our new solar project is a visible reminder to our students that the time horizons they build into their decisions must get longer and longer. An institution like Washington & Lee that benefits so much from those in the past is uniquely positioned to teach an important lesson about our obligations in the future. Thank you all very much.
If the panelists would like to come down.
Oh, good. All right. So I just have to find myself on here?
Yes.
I think I can do that.
You should all set this one. All right, we're running a little behind, but I think it's for good reason. We've had good conversation and fantastic presentations all day. So I will just quickly welcome this panel and introduce the members of the panel. We have Mr. Will Reisinger, the Assistant Attorney General of the state of Virginia.
One of them.
One of them.
There are lots.
I don't want to be... Yeah. For public utility and consumer protection. We have Professor James Van Nostrand, who is the director of the Sustainable Energy Center at West Virginia University Law School, and is also involved in, has been involved for many years in electric utility regulation in private practice. We have Rose McKinney-James, who is currently, who's come to us from Nevada, and we're appreciative of her making the long trip. Is currently with Energy Works LLC, a consulting business, has been involved has served as a public utility commissioner in the state of Nevada, and also as the FERC team lead for the Obama-Biden transition team. We're very excited to have Ms. McKinney-James join us. And we have Mr. Tyson Slocum, the Director of Public Citizens Energy Program, and Mr. Slocum has a long career in working in public policy, testifying and work in the U.S. Congress, and working with the FERC and other regulators on consumer protection and energy environmental issues. And Mr. Jeffrey Mays, the General Counsel for Monitoring Analytics, the independent market monitor. I hope Mr. Mays may explain to the audience in some detail exactly what an independent market monitor is. It's a critical function, and hopefully that will be part of the learning process under the regional power markets. Mr. Mays is General Counsel to an organization that monitors wholesale power, and he can speak to you more about their emerging practice in California under the California Resources Board in monitoring carbon markets in the West. We're also thrilled to have Ms. Carla Urquhart, who is an alumna of the law school here at WNL, and is with the Office of General Counsel at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, participating as a commentator in this panel. And we really look forward to any questions and comments from Ms. Urquhart, who's been very generous to take time to come down from Washington, D.C. and participate at her alma mater in this discussion, which we hope will be valuable to you all. And lastly, I would introduce Professor Al Carr, who teaches the third-year FERC practicum here, has a long history in representing utilities, and chiefly Duke Power, and also a history that you can read. I encourage you to take a look at the bios in your packet, history with federal nuclear and energy regulatory work at the FERC and the NRC, and a prominent role here in educating third-year students about federal energy practice. So, without further ado, I would like to present Professor Al Carr and this panel. Please give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Sam, and thank the members of the panel, and thank you all. How I'd like to proceed, I've got a few introductory things I'd like to say that will try to put things in context, and then we'll just follow the order and panelists set forth in your the document you have in front of you, the schedule. And then Carla has agreed to, after the panelists finish their presentations, Carla will then put them on the spot with questions and that sort of thing. Of course, we welcome questions from the audience. We certainly can make this interactive presentation. And as with the last panel, when the speaker is finished, we'll ask if there are any questions. This is an interesting topic and a timely issue. Environmental issues, environmental considerations, standards, how do we work them in to the regulatory process, which in the case of the United States electric utility industry is the most heavily and pervasively regulated industry in the world. Where do the standards come from? How do we, as I said, how do we integrate them into the regulatory process? How do we deal with the consequences of environmental issues and environmental standards adopted by, I won't say outside outside agencies, but agencies who are not directly involved with regulation of the utility industry, legislators, other agencies, that sort of thing. And importantly, when we consider this, how do we do the economic regulatory considerations necessary to deal with the cost associated with compliance with these environmental standards? How do we deal, or can we deal, with first questioning the efficacy of those standards, or are we limited simply to accepting the standards imposed and dealing, as I said, with the consequences? When we do that, how are the costs allocated and by whom? And the standards used by the economic regulators, or the legislative guidance, is quite broad. It generally is a public interest standard, or in FERC, Federal Power Act language, just and reasonable rates. Now, given that, and then most importantly, given what I characterize as the elephant in the room, because you almost never hear it mentioned at conferences or by proponents of a particular point of view, is the regulatory compact. And what that is in brief is utilities are given assigned service territories with a monopoly right to serve in those territories. We just heard a little bit of the fallout from that. But in exchange for that, the utility, and it's regulated, but particularly the utility, has an absolute and unconditional legal obligation to plan, construct, and operate its system to meet all present and forecasted load in that service territory. Now, in other words, how do the lights stay on? Whose obligation is it? It is the obligation of the utility to keep those lights on with the oversight of the pertinent regulator. Then finally, before we start wondering about how to deal with and balance these competing interests, I'd like to mention one more thing. We hear a lot, and properly so, about renewables, primarily wind and solar. And given the forecast for need for power in this country, we're going to need everything. But keep in mind the elephant in the room, because you've got several questions when you deal with renewables. How do you fit them into your system operation? How do you get the power from the source to the sink? They don't run at a high availability or load factor because they can't. Keeping in mind the obligation, it could be argued that if a utility contracts for 1,000 megawatts of wind power, and lest you think I'm being overly dramatic here, I would ask you to check out the history of the 15,000 megawatts of wind power in Texas over the past summer, past 18 months when it was desperately needed, and ran at about a 7% capacity factor. So if you get 1,000 megawatts of wind power, as a utility to meet your obligation to serve, you're going to have to find backup for that 1,000 megawatts. Who pays all of those costs, and again, how are they allocated? So, with all that as backdrop, I'd like to ask Will to go ahead and make his presentation, and then we'll just follow right on down the line.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Sam, for that introduction earlier. I also want to thank all the members of the journal here and members of the faculty who have helped put this symposium together and invited me to speak. I'm excited that I get to speak first here, and I think that probably guarantees that the presentations will only get better as we go along, so that's good for you all too. As Sam said, I am an Assistant Attorney General. Worked for Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli in the Attorney General's Division of Consumer Counsel. In Virginia, the Attorney General is the consumer advocate or the ratepayer advocate in electric utility cases, and I'll talk about what that means a little bit more in a few minutes. What I want to talk about today is how the regulator in Virginia, which is the State Corporation Commission, considers questions of environmental policy. Dr. Smith said a few minutes ago that one barrier to the development of solar resources in the Commonwealth has been the regulators, and I won't disagree with that, but I will touch on a few points in defense of the regulators that Virginia law currently doesn't give them a whole lot of authority to consider environmental impacts or to promote specific environmental goals. Before I get started, I should probably give my standard disclaimer. It's coming. There it is. I think my boss gets nervous when I speak in public, so I should give this standard disclaimer that any opinions I express are my own, do not necessarily represent views held by the Attorney General or any agencies or employees of the Commonwealth. Hopefully I will not express any views that are controversial, but if I do, I have that disclaimer there. I talked to start about how the Attorney General is the consumer advocate in Virginia. And what that means, as you can see in our statute here, is the Attorney General is charged to represent the interests of the people as consumers. What that means is we're charged with representing residential customers as ratepayers, not necessarily residential customers as entrepreneurs or environmentalists, but specifically as ratepayers. So the Attorney General, when we get involved in rate cases on behalf of ratepayers, we're primarily looking at cost impacts on consumers. Are those cost impacts just and reasonable, and are the utilities investments prudent? And it oftentimes leaves us limited room to consider environmental policy in our advocacy for just and reasonable rates for consumers. I wanted to give a little bit of background on regulation in Virginia, but I think I can probably cut to the chase and just say that Virginia experimented with deregulating generation service in the late 90s. The idea was that by deregulating utility service, we would promote competition. There would be more retail providers of electric energy, and that competition would bring rates down. In short, though, we realized that competition did not materialize in Virginia. And in 2007, the General Assembly passed what we call a Re-Regulation Act, which essentially reaffirmed the State Corporation Commission's authority to set just and reasonable rates, and it reaffirmed the Commission's authority to approve or deny construction projects. The SEC, as I said, regulates investor-owned and cooperative utility operations in the Commonwealth, including rates, and it also can approve or deny construction projects. State Corporation Commission in Virginia serves similar function as public utility commissions or public service commissions in other states. And when we get to the question of how the State Corporation Commission should consider environmental impacts or environmental policy, I think it's helpful to look at the primary factors here in the Virginia Code that the Commission is to consider when they are deciding whether to approve or reject a generation or transmission project. Say a utility wants to build a new power plant and files an application with the Commission, these are the primary factors that the Commission will use when judging that application. Is the project required by the public convenience and necessity? Is it not contrary to the public interest? And also the Commission can consider the reasonableness and prudence of costs. Those are the primary factors that we've seen that the Commission uses when deciding whether to approve a particular project. But I think there's a valid question that should the SEC also consider environmental impacts when deciding whether to approve generation construction projects. For example, if Dominion Power comes to the SEC with a proposal to build a new coal-fired power plant right up the road here, should the State Corporation Commission consider the potential environmental impacts of that project before it grants approval? I don't know if anyone wants to raise their hand if you think that the SEC should consider environmental impacts when judging. We've got one, we've got Sierra Club, we've got a couple others. Okay. We've got one on the panel here. I think it's a very very valid point. But as you can see here, the Commission is somewhat limited by the primary factors in the code. Also in the Virginia Code is what's called the Commonwealth Energy Policy. It's a discretionary, aspirational policy, and I've put a few excerpts on the screen there. Basically, the policy says that agencies in the Commonwealth, when carrying out their duties, should consider these goals, should try to promote the research and development of renewable energy, promote the research and development of clean coal technologies, promote energy conservation, demand-side management, and they should also promote the generation of electricity through technologies that do not contribute to greenhouse gases and global warming. So in the Commonwealth Energy Policy, things like climate change, greenhouse gases are specifically referenced. But I said this Commonwealth Energy Policy is a discretionary thing, and the Commission is not bound by it. It merely has to consider these goals when deciding whether to approve or deny a particular project. I think one good example of how the Commonwealth Energy Policy was used or not used in practice was an application filed by Appalachian Power in 2008. Appalachian Power wanted to build what's called an IGCC coal plant, an integrated gasification and combined cycle coal plant. Essentially, it's a variety of advanced coal technology that instead of traditionally combusting the coal, it gasifies the coal, and I believe it results in more efficient use of coal, fewer emissions, and this plant would have been carbon capture compatible, so that the utility could have captured the carbon emissions before they were emitted into the sky and could have sequestered that carbon dioxide underground. This was an expensive project, though. It had a $2.2 billion price tag. That $2.2 billion price tag was going to be paid by customers of Appalachian Power. Virginia customers, I believe, were going to pay approximately $1 billion in those costs, and West Virginia customers were going to pay the other $1.2 billion in costs. One of the issues was it reasonable and prudent for Appalachian Power to make this multi-billion-dollar investment in technology that would reduce carbon dioxide emissions from its coal plants? Is it reasonable for the power company to do that when there are not any environmental laws in place that mandate this technology, when there are not any environmental laws in place that place a price on carbon emissions? And the State Corporation Commission, the Attorney General also argued against the prudence of this project, and the Commission rejected the proposal, said that it was not prudent, was not in the public interest. quoting language from the order there. The Commission said the Commonwealth's energy policy does not override this Commission's obligation to determine whether the proposed IGCC plant is reasonable and prudent. The Commission also said we cannot ask Virginia customers to bear the enormous risks and huge potential costs of this project in light of all the uncertainty that exists. Now, real quickly, I want to make clear that Virginia law does authorize utilities to recover costs that they incur to comply with federal and state environmental laws. There are lots of new regulations coming out under the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and there's potential for more federal legislation and rulemaking regarding greenhouse gas emissions. Any environmental law that a utility has to comply with, it can recover its costs from consumers, but the statute does say utilities may only recover actual costs necessary to comply with those environmental regulations. And that essentially means that the Commission is not going to allow utility to go over and above necessarily, may not authorize costs that are not necessary to meet environmental laws, to meet the requirements of the environmental laws. And that's an issue that my office, the Attorney General, would get involved with if a utility were seeking to recover costs from consumers that were not necessary to comply with environmental laws. Then my office would take a close look at those expenses to see whether they were really prudent expenses that should be charged to customers. Finally, I want to talk about another piece in Virginia's Re-Regulation Act, Virginia's Renewable Portfolio Standard. A renewable portfolio standard, or an RPS, as I believe we discussed earlier, is basically a mandate or a goal that requires utilities to obtain a certain percentage of their power from renewable energy sources like wind, solar, biomass, hydroelectric power. And Virginia does have a voluntary RPS goal. The utilities are allowed to participate in this program, and they can. The eventual goal is for the utilities to obtain 15% of their energy from renewable sources by the year 2025. But the Commission has also said that in decisions that while the RPS is obviously policy of the state of Commonwealth of Virginia, General Assembly passed it into law, it's not necessarily going to be used as a blank check. The utilities can't make any investment that they want to, regardless of prudence, and they can't expect to recover every cost from consumers if they're not necessary to meet that RPS goal. I'll give just a couple examples here. My point is that not all renewable energy projects have met the reasonable and prudent standard. One example also from Appalachian Power in 2009, APCO sought to purchase wind energy from out-of-state wind developers, and they were going to use some of that energy, some of that generation in the form of renewable energy credits. They were going to apply that to their RPS goal, but they didn't really need that energy at the time to meet their RPS goal for the particular year. So they were essentially seeking to procure excess renewable energy, which you may believe that there's a really good policy reason for a utility to procure excess renewable energy, but when it's not strictly necessary to meet Virginia's RPS goal, it's not clear to the Attorney General, and the Commission has shown this as well, it's not clear that that is going to be deemed a reasonable cost that should be passed on to consumers. Similar issue came up in Dominion's proposed conversion of 3 coal-fired power plants to burn biomass. The Attorney General opposed those applications, basically said it was not going to be a prudent investment. The converted facilities would be producing technically renewable energy. There might actually be a legal argument about that, but they're producing energy from biomass, which theoretically could be used for the RPS program. But nonetheless, the Attorney General argued that those conversions were not cost effective, were not necessary to meet the RPS goals, and as a result, customers should not have to pay for those expenses. Not quite sure what I was thinking when I put this slide together. I guess the slide answers a couple questions. One, this is the conclusion of my presentation. Two, I do have a conclusion, I think, and I believe the conclusion of my talk is that in Virginia, at least, the regulator charged with regulating electric utility activities is not going to try to make policy. We're going to leave policy making to the General Assembly, and the primary duty is going to be looking at projects on an individual basis. Are they prudent projects? Do they make sense for the utilities customers? And that's certainly the approach that the Attorney General uses when looking at projects on an individual basis. I'm happy to answer any questions now about what I do in the Attorney General's office, or feel free to contact me if you want to know what we do or why you're giving us tax money, that sort of thing. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And does anyone have questions they'd like to ask Will now, or just wait till the end?
I'm not understanding the argument about purchasing the wind power, You're saying it isn't reasonable and prudent to plan more than 1 year in advance?
We're saying at that time, and this was several years before I was with the office, so that's a caveat there. But at the time when APCO entered into those contracts, they did not show that they needed the energy not only to meet their current goal, but that they needed that energy for the future. And they didn't show that those particular contracts were reasonable and prudent. And that's why the Attorney General opposed those contracts. I mean, certainly it's prudent to plan to meet your RPS goals because they do go into the future to 2025.
So it wasn't the source then, it was the quantity of energy.
It was the quantity and
Did
the
not fit
price.
into the load
Did not.
profile.
Well, good afternoon. I know, Sam, I'm having technical difficulties.
Yes,
it's always the technology maker that has those challenges. So.
If you could go ahead and start your talk, we'll have us in just a minute. Is that okay? I can't seem to figure out.
All right, I'll give that a shot. Well, everything is on this little box. It makes it a little challenging. But first off, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I think it was well worth the flight to come out because what I've experienced so far has been extremely helpful in my own sort of development around my career choice, which is advocacy around the actual deployment of renewable resources on a commercial basis. And I've been doing that for some time. You'll note in my bio that many years ago, more than I like to admit, I served as a member of the Public Service Commission in Nevada. And one of the things I was struck with at the time was a number of entities coming to the state seeking and requesting opportunities to pursue projects to explore the phenomenal resource that we have in Nevada and finding an absolute and clear block, both regulatory and otherwise, to any advancement of those efforts. The challenge then was significant from the standpoint of those of us who were trying to determine a path forward. And I simply found it intriguing and made my way to a path that I now look back on almost 20 years, where I found myself in a number of forums, thank you, as a single voice. Thank you, Andy.
You're welcome.
Attempting to advance this. So I'm very grateful to be here. One of the things I noted, and I've noted with my fellow panelists and some of the other speakers, is I'm a little bit of an odd duck here, I think, because I'm not a professor. I am not an academic. I'm an advocate. And I have been trained as such over the years. Let me see if I can figure this part out, too. Oh, yeah. And it's something that you sort of are, it's inspirational. So here's part of my inspiration. If he can think it, then it's okay for me to think it. Okay, how does this thing work? It's not doing anything.
I'm not touching it.
Okay. Left click. Okay, we'll try that. Thank you. So part of what I've done over the course of these years, and when I say the UNCOLA, you know, it's non-traditional work. I'm required to work with community leaders who are not always sophisticated but feel very strongly about certain issues. I am required to work with regulators, and as a former regulator, I have some sensitivity to their needs. I'm required to work with legislators who, in my experience, know everything about everything. And I also work very closely with non-governmental organizations. Particularly, I spent a decade as a member of the board of directors of the Energy Foundation, where we found funds that we spread across the country in an effort to advance the clean energy conversation. So I think different paths lead to potentially different voices. I graduated not far from here from Antioch Law School in Washington, D.C. And that was an interesting experiment. We were focused on developing advocates who would go into the community and do good, do well. I sought and completed a certification as an economic development professional. During my service as a member of the Public Service Commission, because I was the new commissioner and the other members of the commission were fighting over this docket, the chairman made the wise decision to give me the docket, and I ended up crafting the first environmental externality rules in the state. I've been a registered lobbyist in Nevada since 1983, and so I have a slightly different voice, different path. I noted as I summarized this presentation on the plane that I continue to use the words challenge and barrier. Those are the two words I've faced for most of my career. And I can't seem to write anything that doesn't include those two phrases. Thank you, Professor. Significant political pushback, and it shifts depending on what's happening on a national basis. Significant challenges related to the interaction between federal regulators and state regulators and state policy. One of the things that I found very frustrating has been overall the limited resources that are actually devoted to community and customer outreach and education. People are trying to make decisions without an adequate basis for doing so. And in the scheme of all of this, we're dealing with rapid changes in technology. So just as we get people prepared to take on one technology, something else comes up and it makes it even more challenging. So you know I've come from Las Vegas. I was happy to have a chance to have a meal in a place that actually has a neon sign here. Someone pointed out, thank you Amy, that I was having a little deprivation there, but this is absolutely beautiful country. I can see why you want to be here. Going back actually farther than 1995, Nevada has been involved in pushing policies around environmental sustainability. I think we were one of the first states to actually adopt integrated resource planning rules. In 1995, the legislature created this path for us where it gave some priority to indigenous resources. In 1997, in my capacity as the Chief Executive Officer for CSTAR, the Corporation for Solar Technologies and Renewable Resources, along with the gentleman who was kind enough to help me, Howard Wanger. Some of you may know Howard. It was with SunPower. We sat down and actually crafted the first RPS for the state. And you can see that it was a very small increment. But that increment took a very solid lobbying effort. We barely got out of committee. And I'm not sure how we got it through the process, but maybe just dogged determination to establish at least a baseline for an RPS in the state. Thereafter, and Carla, you know that Chairman Willinghoff and I are old colleagues and friends. It was, in fact, John Willinghoff, who's the current chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who was responsible in his prior life pushing forward a very aggressive RPS target in Nevada. And that's been revised in 05, 09, and again in 11, and we now have a target of 25% by 25. It also includes a provision that requires an energy efficiency component. So I've been dealing with these key messages for quite some time. I am happy to see new and stronger voices. In my abstract, I pointed, let me say something else. I've never done an abstract before. Thank you, Sam. It was quite an interesting experience. I do note that after you write it and you get past the deadline, you start thinking about a lot of different things, so just ignore that. With the exception of the fact that the important thing in this most recent general rate case was that we had at least 5 interveners who'd never been a part of the regulatory process. They were representing the interest of Native American tribes. They were representing the Sierra Club, Environmental Voices. They brought a completely different perspective to our regulatory proceedings. And part of their strategy was, because Sam did ask me to talk a little bit about demand response, part of their strategy was to focus on those aspects of our supply chain that, in their view, could be revisited. That is, we've had over the years quite a fight with respect to new coal plants. The argument on the other side is that with more demand response and energy efficiency, we could actually find a way to reduce the consumption and new generation of certain fossil fuels. And that argument was fairly compelling in this process. To the extent that the presiding commissioner has bifurcated the proceeding to specifically address that argument. So it's ongoing, but at least it's in the regulatory arena. The lack of coordination in many instances with the federal government and states becomes a point of contention. I think the word that we've heard today is tension. In many instances, it's more than just tension. It's just downright distrust. And so it's very difficult to advocate in an environment like that. However, I do believe that, and I think there is a recent FERC report that suggests that there is data that demonstrates increased usage and acceptance by the public for more environmentally sustained methodologies. We talked a little bit earlier about the FERC, and I underscore my view that leadership is important. There have been a number of actions that have been undertaken consistent with the jurisdiction of FERC, but I'm referencing now this report, the 11 report, the staff assessment on demand response. And this report noted a number of areas which reflect increased penetration and higher consumer confidence and acceptance of these efforts going forward. We do have barriers to the deployment of demand response and energy efficiency efforts. Everybody talks about a smart grid. Few consumers really understand what that means. And because they don't understand, they are raising questions. And there are others, external folks who are raising questions. But the 3 areas that come to mind are data security, customer privacy, and health concerns. state legislators and regulators, I think, continue to have difficulty with their ongoing balancing act here. But to the extent that they're supportive, they're usually supportive because they see an economic development opportunity, that there is a revenue stream there somewhere for their state. And of course, no presentation from a political person would be appropriate without some reference to job creation, because that seems to be the mantra. I believe that Amy's already referenced the jurisdictional issues, but I think it's important to note that within the Energy Independence Act and EPAC, the opportunity for FERC now to really promote a framework for enhanced demand response within wholesale energy markets now exists, and several rulemakings have been undertaken to flesh that out so that it is an active part of their activities. And they're indicating that has become one of 3 or 4 top initiatives to include integration of renewables, smart grid, and electric vehicles. They're also focused on transmission planning and transportation. We talked a little bit about FERC Order 1000, but I think it's important to note that this is more than just a regulatory proceeding. This really is a critical step forward, both in terms of leadership and innovation, to have these parties actually talking about a path to putting renewables on the grid and using demand response as another means of achieving greater efficiency in our provision of electricity. I had the opportunity to chat with the Commissioner of Nevada who's responsible for renewable development. I had an opportunity while I was waiting in the airport yesterday to speak to Chairman Wellinghoff. There is some frustration around traditional rate design and even integrated resource planning requirements in terms of how to break through in some of these areas. But these conversations are ongoing, and I hate to say the more things change, the more they remain the same, because I am really seeing some glimmers of light going forward. So now it's time for my conclusion. I think progress has been made. I'm still looking for that bold, game-changing development. I am happy to see the expansion of additional voices in the regulatory process. I note that regulators, I was at the NAWIC meeting a few weeks ago, are now open to conversations around collaboration, but I still don't see clear paths to achieve that. I think we are able to see some new tools for measuring our success, and at the end of every process that deals with regulation, we have to look at the notion of balance. Everything in balance. So thank you.
So do we have any questions for Lieutenant James at this point?
Thanks, Rose and Will. Very interesting. I feel like you both provided examples of the ways that state legislatures are causing blockage to the generation of consideration of something else, the non-quantifiable benefits of environmental renewables or energy efficiency, demand response, whatever it may be. So since we've talked earlier theoretically about the proper role for the federal government and whether maybe they should be involved in providing a framework, how or what difference would you see, for the good or for the bad, if there was an alternative universe where the federal government could perhaps provide a definition of in the public interest that included consideration of environmental concerns as well as suggested, or renewable energy? Would this just become one factor in the consideration, and then the PUCs implementing such a standard would still find a way to jerry-rig it and say, oh, but in the end, the economic costs still don't justify the environmental benefits?
And that last observation is truly the challenge. But I wanted to go back to something that Bill said during his presentation, which is that the states really are the laboratories for experimentation. There is no such thing as one size fits all. And if you are speaking from a state perspective, you feel strongly that there is no one size fits all. But if you're trying to achieve a larger goal, removing some of the uncertainty, creating some uniformity, I think becomes really important. And that's the role, I think, of the federal government in terms of coordination, not limiting, I guess is the word I'm looking for, the ability of states to do what makes sense, particularly in a regional format. I think we're doing more incrementally from a regional standpoint than we've ever done. Now, you know, Nevada sits right next to California, and they've got a huge appetite for renewables. The ability to get that power to them, to come up with strategies for export, to figure out the transmission issues, all of those things are huge challenges for us. And so it does require, in my view, some sort of federal format, but who knows how we get there. And yes, as long as there are legislators and regulators who feel that they have, you know, the answer, there's always going to be pushback.
I think you mentioned that Nevada has a rule that includes consideration of externalities. Did I hear that?
Yes, that is correct.
Can you explain how it works?
Well, it's an interesting, it was an interesting docket. Basically, in resource planning, the utilities are required to at least look at a range of externalities to include the release of greenhouse gases and health issues. There's a whole range of points within that general order. But at the end of the day, they're not required. They're required to look at it, but they're not mandated then to have that influence their bottom line decision. So let me just say, as a presiding officer, I had a choice of either getting something on the books and getting the 3 votes that I needed for that to happen. And the only way to make that happen was to remove the language that I had in there that it made it a mandate. So it's not a mandate. The only aspect of it that is mandated is that it has to be considered. But there's no requirement to connect the actual resource selections to it.
Would you say that it's had an effect?
I would say that it's probably had limited impact.
Oh, I'm up. Great. Can I stand up here?
Sure.
Is that all right? Thank you. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Tyson. I run the Energy and Climate Program with Public Citizen. We're a nonprofit advocacy and research organization in Washington, D.C. So before I jump into the nitty-gritty of FERC issues and environmental costs, I first just want to start with kind of a bigger picture issue. Very often, the debate in Washington, D.C. over energy policy is framed as one where we do not have adequate access to fossil fuel resources. The mantra is often, man, if regulators would just get out of the way and allow us to access more of our coal and oil and natural gas, we could create the jobs and energy production to liberate this country from foreign sources of energy. Right? That is a narrative that is very, very common in this country. Who is the largest oil-producing nation in the world? Any guesses? I'm asking you guys. Yes? Saudi Arabia. Yes. Very good. They're the biggest. Who's the second biggest? Russia. Who's the third biggest? The United States. Very few Americans know that. 9.6 million barrels of oil every day produced in the United States. Who's the largest natural gas producer in the world? Russia. Who's second? The United States. China is the largest coal producer. Who's behind them? The United States. When you put it together, there's no other country that is in the top 3 in all those categories except for us. We are far and away the largest fossil fuel producing nation on the planet. We kick serious behind when it comes to producing fossil fuel. The issue is not one of inadequate access to fossil fuel production. right? We dominate. Our industries are huge. They are mature, they are advanced, and they are extraordinarily profitable, right? When the average cost for ExxonMobil to extract a barrel of oil in its portfolio is $18 a barrel, and what's the market price of oil right now? 100? You do the math. That's a great business model to be in. The issue is not inadequate access to fossil fuel production. It's the fact that the cheap access to fossil fuels that we relied on for so much of our economic growth in the 20th century is no longer going to become a reality. Our infrastructure was designed to accommodate access to $1 a gallon fuel. And that worked awesome when gasoline was $1 a gallon. It is never going to be anywhere close to $1 a gallon again. And as long as that's the case, our transportation infrastructure needs to be significantly updated. And all the politicians that implicitly or directly promise an ability to return to that are absolutely not being truthful. Now, natural gas right now is cheap because of some recent access to domestic reserves. But to guarantee cheap natural gas for the next 5, 10, 20 years would also be a fallacy. Because the fact is that everyone in DC is talking about moving towards producing a heck of a lot more natural gas, or using a lot more natural gas. And coal, which has always been cheap and continues to be cheap, when you do not include its environmental externalities, even folks within the utility industry acknowledge that we cannot continue on the business as usual path. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is how we deal with changing the status quo. Because from a price standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, nothing we are doing now is sustainable. I don't care what industry you're in, but we cannot afford the status quo. And so what are the solutions? I recently attended the annual conference of the U.S. Energy, I forget what it's called, but it's basically the big energy production members. So the American Petroleum Institute spoke, the Edison Electric Institute, which represents corporate utilities. They all got up there and they all took turns bashing the EPA and their looming regulations. And that's a fun and cheap activity to do. Now, in 2009 and 2010, Congress, working with many of these entities, understanding the 2007 Supreme Court decision that said, hey, the Clean Air Act requires the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, everybody acknowledged that that wasn't the best way to go about it, so they came up with an alternative. They said, okay, we'll come up with this complex cap-and-trade scheme, and part of that Waxman-Markey bill that passed the House of Representatives included a provision kicking the EPA out of regulating greenhouse gas emissions. It was an effort to placate industry and replace a EPA Clean Air Act regulatory model with a market-based cap-and-trade approach. Now that cap-and-trade approach was criticized by many, including me, for being too convoluted, too complex, and too full of loopholes. But the fact is that in 2009 you had industry in the negotiating room working on a compromise. And the few that were outside that room took a strategy of not just attacking the legislation, but of attacking the underlying science. And that is now the reality that we have, where the Republicans fielded a presidential candidate in 2008 that was a leader in taking legislative approaches to dealing with climate change. And now you've got candidates on the campaign trail who are universally claiming that there is no need for the United States to deal with greenhouse gas emissions because the science is a fraud. It is a remarkable chain of events that is the result of a very, very powerful fossil fuel industry in the United States that produces millions and millions of barrels of oil, millions of cubic feet of natural gas, tons and tons of coal, and the status quo is very, very lucrative. And so the question is, is there an alternative path forward? Now, one of our economic competitors, a country called Germany, has, it's a high-wage manufacturing export nation that is, at this point, single-handedly running the euro, right? They're in charge of bailing out entire other countries. They spend $30 billion a year on feed-in tariffs and have 630% more installed solar capacity than the United States. There were more patents given to German-based companies in the clean tech space than in the United States. Whereas the United States dominates the world in fossil fuel production, our economic competitors, some of whom are high-wage manufacturing export, high-growth economies, are beating us in the clean tech race. And I think that's where the future lies. Now, as part of the debate on climate change, my organization, we had problems with the cap and trade approach. We worked with the office of Senator Maria Cantwell, a Democrat from Washington State, and we lined up a Republican colleague. We were the only bipartisan climate bill in the United States Senate in 2009 and 2010. Our Republican colleague was Susan Collins, and we put together a carbon pricing bill that had bipartisan support, that distributed money back to consumers, that we thought was a progressive solution. When we sat down and worked with other allies, we realized that carbon pricing schemes in the current electricity markets was going to be a problem. Now, we heard from the Assistant Attorney General of Virginia about Virginia's system of firmly regulated utility pricing, right? Where any sort of hard environmental cost is factored into rate making. All the costs are figured into how prices are set. And what we realized was that the deregulated markets, so not Virginia, but say PJM, New York, California, parts of the Midwest, that these markets are administered by FERC, which delegates sweeping authorities to private transmission organizations, where actual costs are not figured into rates. Instead, individual entities simply need to say, we don't have market power, and they're allowed to charge market-based rates. And we did a study along with the association that represents all 50 state utility commissions that found if we established a national federal carbon price of $20 a metric ton, that it would result in billions of dollars in windfall profits in these FERC jurisdictional markets because of the lack of transparency and effective competition in the way that these market-based rates work. And so we want to see we at Public Citizen believe that going forward, one of the more important reforms that we need to do is to price carbon in a consumer-friendly way that will generate the revenues needed to make investments in the clean tech space, while providing the right incentives in the power generation space to provide the incentives necessary to not incentivize carbon-intensive generation and to give proper incentives to cleaner generation. And in order to do that, we've got to have a market structure that's more transparent than we currently have. Now, without getting into all of the details of what that would look like, one thing that we did successfully work on as we were describing this issue to our congressional colleagues during the Waxman-Markey debate and then in the Senate with the Kerry Lieberman bill was the need to have an Office of Consumer Advocate at FERC. Most states have some sort of Office of Consumer Advocate that expressly is there to serve the interests of household consumers. And if anyone is experienced with work before FERC, it's a complex agency. It's extraordinarily expensive to get involved because you have to have Federal Power Act trained attorneys. And most public interest groups lack that ability to finance effective participation before FERC. And I've had conversations with Chairman Wellinghoff about this, and he agreed in principle to the concept of establishing an Office of Consumer Advocacy. So we think that it's a critical reform going forward that shouldn't just include outreach and advocacy for consumer groups like mine, but for environmental organizations and community organizations. If we're talking about giving FERC expanded authority for siting of transmission lines, which many argue is needed to bring large-scale renewable projects in Wyoming and the desert west into the market, that ensuring that we've got mechanisms in place that adequately ensure that public interest and community representation is in front of FERC, I think is pretty essential. Shortly after getting the nomination to be chairman of FERC, John Wellinghoff gave a very famous interview where he said, you know, we really need to rethink the future of our electricity system. We no longer need baseload generation, that we need to move towards a distributed, smaller scale renewable energy system anchored by renewables. Within hours of that interview, there was swift and immediate criticism from the status quo industry, because those were dangerous words, and he later had to walk back from them. But what he said is absolutely true, and there's a mountain of engineering, technical, and economic literature talking about the future of our energy system has to be decentralized. The old system worked great when we had easy, available, cheap, and access to fossil fuels. That future is not going to be the 21st century. In order to deal with a transformative event like climate change, we have to make transformative changes in our energy system. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions for Mr. Slocum at this point?
Yes. Could you tell us more when you said pricing carbon in a consumer-friendly way? Are you talking about trying to kind of level the playing field and factor in externalities, or do you have a particular structure in mind for dealing with issues of higher carbon costs, but also the reality that people may be locked into a beat-up van or something, and so you might end up having a regressive pricing structure?
Absolutely. In the bipartisan climate legislation that we worked on, and there are many variations of this, but this is the particular legislation that we got sponsored in the United States Senate. All fossil fuel producers and all entities importing fossil fuels would be required to obtain permits that would be classified based upon the underlying carbon content of that fossil fuel. And that permit would be acquired at an auction that would be run by the federal government. The federal government would collect 100% of those revenues from that auction, and between 75 and 80% of those revenues would immediately be returned to American families on a per capita basis. So if you're a family of one like me, I'd get one check. If I'm a family of four, I'd get a check 4 times the size of mine. Now, that was a very simple but easy way to deal with offsetting the costs. And on a general way, more than 80% of families, in an independent analysis conducted by MIT economists, 80% of families would come out ahead in that scenario. We were approached by a number of Midwestern senators who said, look, the Midwest has a higher portfolio of coal, and they showed us their tables that showed higher costs there, and so we would definitely have considerations for geographic differences in generation portfolios that I think also could be extended to geographic differences with motor gasoline consumption. So there are variations on that, whether it's a direct check, whether it's deductions through the payroll tax. The fact is the federal government has a million different venues, whether it's HUD, housing assistance, whether it's the Agriculture Department's food stamp program. There's a number of ways to deliver financial assistance to folks if we're going to price carbon. And so there's no question any sort of carbon pricing scheme is going to raise direct energy costs, and it's also going to create other indirect cost increases throughout the economy. So mitigating that, particularly for vulnerable families and politically for moderate income families, I think is essential to having a successful policy change going forward.
Yes, I was very intrigued with your mentioning of Germany, because you, as you may recall, Photon magazine had an article a couple months ago which looked at how 20% of Germany's electric power production at peak demand times is produced by renewable solar and wind sources, and has effectively lowered the cost of peak demand pricing in Germany. So I thank you for bringing that example up about Germany not only being a competitor in terms of the science of clean technology, but also demonstrating how feed-in tariffs have really lowered the cost of peak demand power.
Right. I mean, I think there's no question that we're seeing the rest of the world understand where the future of energy production lies. And the United States is not moving as quickly as a lot of our economic competitors. And there are short-term costs. I mean, moving towards a renewable future involves a number of large short-term costs that have to be accounted for. There is no free lunch, whether you're on the status quo path or whether you're on a transformative path. All of it is going to involve costs. The question is where the long-term benefits lie. And I think it's a difficult case to make that the status quo is going to continue delivering long-term value for today's investments.
Okay. Thank you. And Professor Van Nostrand. Yep.
Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to come home to Virginia. Let me see if I can figure out how this works exactly. I'm really here to make one very simple point, and that is that the impact of environmental regulation on energy prices is actually happening now, and that the cost of environmental regulation is being built into wholesale prices now, and that many decisions are being made now that are reflecting the makeup of the future generation fleet. And what I'm mostly going to try to do is provide the context of how that is happening, because we can expect there will be lots of controversy and regulatory activity in the coming years, and understanding exactly how environmental costs are being translated into wholesale power prices will be important to making good decisions as that activity occurs. This slide shows PJM Interconnection, and it's probably one of the most important companies that you've never heard of. And most of the people here are probably in states that are covered by that region. And one reason why you've never heard of it is that it doesn't own any assets, and it's a really curious legal question as to who owns it. But what it does is it operates the grid, the bulk power grid, and it operates the wholesale market for that entire region, and it essentially defines the market for what is a very large and important portion of the United States. It is the largest control operator in the world, and what happens, how costs are translated to PJM are actually very important from a national perspective. And The role of monitoring analytics, we're the market monitor of PJM. We are independent, in the same sense that PJM is independent of the owners of the asset it operates. We're independent of PJM, we're independent of all the market participants. We're separately funded through an adder to the FERC rate. Our role is basically when the Commission first decided to move towards regulation through competition in electricity markets, they wanted to make sure they understood how those markets operated. They understand they would be complex. So they had each of the wholesale markets. PJM was one. There are others in New York, New England, in the Midwest, in California, in Texas. But they wanted to make sure that they understood how those markets were operating. So they had an independent economic analysis department of the RTOs originally. Now we're completely institutionally separate. Set up to look at those markets and to report on their performance, to look at the behavior of market participants and try to detect exercise of market power, manipulation. You can think of the situation in California and Enron as an example of what the market monitor is looking for. But most importantly to this discussion is our role in market design. And that is that these wholesale markets have a lot of rules about exactly how they operate. It's necessary to enact regulation through competition, and there's some details I'll go into later. Those rules are complicated. They're even more complicated than they need to be. And an important role the market monitor plays is advising how to make those rules serve the public interest in a context of the context in which those rules are designed. And that context is something called the PJM stakeholder process. And that process is it is a committee that is composed of the suppliers, the owners of the transmission assets. There's supposed to be load representatives in the stakeholder process. State commissions participate in this process. It's very parliamentary in nature. It has many committees that are specialized into the various components of the market. And it's that process that generates the rules that ultimately are followed by PJM with FERC for approval. And that is where market design comes from. We are an active participant in that process. Most parties there are there obviously with an eye to their economic interests. We're there for the public interest in efficient and competitive wholesale markets. And in exchange for having the independence we have and performing those functions, one of the things that we don't do is we can't tell anyone to do anything. Our role is strictly advisory, and it's based on our unique access to the data about how PJM operates, all of it very confidential. So to get into the impact, the way in which energy regulation impacts wholesale prices, one of the first things we need to do is have a quick lesson in economics. And that is, if you look at this is a simple chart showing supply and demand. And the first cross there is supply and demand. It shows a certain price. For reasons that economics can explain, that shows a socially optimal price. And the theoretical question I'll put to you is, what happens if someone comes along with a market that is functioning in equilibrium and says, you have to have an additional amount of supply above what is needed to have that optimal connection of supply and demand. And what you can see happens is it causes the price to go down. The quantity goes out, the price goes down. And if you look at that rectangle between P and P prime, and basically between P and P prime, that would arguably be missing money. That is a market that will not be able to sustain itself because the suppliers are not going to make enough money due to that price reduction to supply the amount of product that's desired. And so this is critical in understanding how this problem translates into the wholesale energy markets. And that is something that's been referred to as the missing money problem. And that is that, as was discussed before, utilities have reliability requirements. One of those is referred to as resource adequacy. And what that means is that it's not enough to have the generation that is sufficient to meet the current demand for energy at any time, including the peak time. There has to be a buffer of resources there to meet any demand. It's a serious reliability problem if at any point the power runs out It is particularly difficult in an industry like the electric industry where there's a big lead time to build sources. And so if we ever got to a sort of situation, it would be a long time before we'd be able to sort it out. And so what that means is that there has to be more energy capacity around than the amount that is forecast for the peak highest demand day. And so, as we saw in the economics, what that means is that the energy price is never going to be sufficient to maintain the supply fleet being necessary to supply the market. And so energy prices are not enough. You have to have something to address this missing money problem. And this means, as it translates to various types of units in the portfolio, that combustion turbines, these are plants that have low investment cost and high run cost. Their main purpose is to exist to be around to turn on only on those peak days. They're unlikely to cover any of their fixed costs. Many of them will be there just in case, and so they're not going to cover their cost of energy. But it's also true of all units, because this is a single market price we're talking about. So whether it's a combined cycle, which is something that's going to be more likely to be dispatched in a shorter period, or even a coal plant, they're also going to have a corresponding price shortfall. They're going to be getting an uneconomic signal to exit the market. One of the misconceptions that's out there is that one of the reasons why you have this missing money problem is that suppliers in that market are not allowed to exercise market power. And what they attempt to do is say the missing money problem is really the fact they have offer caps. Now, it should be understood in these markets, despite market-based rates authority, suppliers don't actually have the right to offer anything that they want at all times. We have a mitigation program that's in effect that basically identifies times when the market is not competitive, and when that occurs, the ability to offer any price is suspended, and instead suppliers are required to send a cost-based offer. That cost-based offer is calculated on what a competitive offer would look like in true competitive conditions. And so this obviously is not something that suits the interest of a lot of people that supply power, and so they would love to blame the missing problem on that, and so I'd like to take this opportunity to explain that that's really not what's going on at all. What you have is a problem that is just built into the design of a market if it were to rely on energy and were not to have any supplemental source of payment. Corollary to that is that market power is not required to make competitive markets work, and what I'm going to show you is a different solution. What this is a chart, and you don't really need to look at this in detail. The basic point is it illustrates, for purposes right now, the missing money problem. And that is, let's ignore the stripe part above and focus only on the solid lines for the last 3 years. This shows in each of the zones of PJM net revenues from energy. The line way up there at the top, that is the cost that's basically the entry, the market entry signal. Someone is going to have to expect they're going to make that cost on average over usually 20 years is what's used. A future period in order to justify going forward with an investment in a new plant. What this illustrates is for a CT, the kind of plant that typically is not operating at all times of the year but at peak. It's not going to make anywhere near in the energy market what it needs to stay in the market. And what this shows is a similar graph showing zone by zone. The top zones are some of the zones in PJM that are most supply constrained. And even there, you can see they're falling below the entry signal. Less so for a combined cycle market, combined cycle plant. These are typically natural gas plants. They're closer to what an entry will look like, particularly in some of the constrained zones. But if you look at just energy, that's not the case. And it's not the case even in some of the most constrained areas. This is a look at coal plants. And that line shows what you would expect to make over 20 years if you wanted to build a new coal plant somewhere. It includes the cost of environmental compliance. If you look typically where a coal plant makes its energy is not from capacity, but mostly from the energy market, because coal, they operate in a baseload mode, meaning they run all the time, meaning they collect energy throughout the year, meaning that their need for that additional missing money is not as great, except if you look at the current market reality now, it is great. That solid line is what they can expect to make from energy, and they're coming nowhere near an incentive to invest. In fact, there's a strong incentive not to invest in coal showing up in the market. And that is appropriate in the context of some of the environmental objectives that are being considered today. And you can also extrapolate from that the situation of an incumbent coal unit, also trying to rely on those prices. And I think one factor I mentioned there too is that because gas has become so relatively cheap, many coal plants face, in addition to an environmental challenge, also a spark spread issue. Their advantage in runtime over gas has been reduced, and so that's partly reflected there. Oops. Which brings us to the PJM capacity market. Capacity is another important product that you were paying for, and have always been paying for when you buy electricity. In the past, you haven't seen it in your bill, and you still don't see it in your bill if you're looking at a bill from a distributor that's giving you pricing based on average pricing. But to understand how the wholesale market works, it is a very important component of the wholesale market. Basically, what the capacity market addresses is two things. One is the resource adequacy. It's where the reliability requirement and the need to have enough generation to meet that requirement is met. That's widely understood that it serves this reliability function. What's less understood is that it also is intended to recover the missing money. So it serves a very important marketing function too. And because offers are mitigated to competitive levels, that means market power is not going to solve the missing money problem. You're going to have to rely on a capacity market. And this brings us to where environmental costs come in. The capacity market, one of the major costs to comply with environmental regulations has to do with investment in new equipment and plant. That will be included as a part of that even mitigated offer, show what the cost of that new investment in capital will be. So when we're calculating mitigated offers, and I should say in the capacity market, because it's inherently a tight market, almost all offers are mitigated, unlike in energy all the time. That API component, which is a calculated cost of environmental investment, is going to be critical. And one of the market monitor's functions is it reviews these cost levels in offers into the capacity market and approves that they're reasonable and basically performs a sanity check. If it found something was not reasonable, it would go to FERC and complain that essentially it was involving an exercise of market power. And so that is the component where environmental costs are being considered. And so one thing about the capacity market is it is procuring capacity in advance. The capacity market is 3 years forward. So while energy is procuring energy day by day, capacity is procured 3 years forward in order to have a more liquid market that allows new entrants to compete along with incumbents to meet that capacity need. And so it essentially defines the overall size and makeup of the generation fleet, and it does so 3 years ahead. So this May, PJM is going to conduct what it calls a base residual auction for capacity. And what it's going to do is it's going to obligate all the consumers ultimately in PJM to purchase capacity to be provided 3 years from now at the price determined by that market. And so when we are considering this project investment that goes into calculating their mitigated offers, and we are talking to companies about what their expectations are, not what their expectations are now, but what their expectations are 3 years from now, and whether or not they're going to have to build new investment in order to keep a plant in business. It might also determine whether they decide to retire a unit. And so that discussion is happening now. And when we look at regulations and their impact, even if they're uncertain, they're factored in now. And so when that market clears in May, if owners of generation believe reasonably that they have a significant compliance cost to meet, it will be included in their offer, and likely one of those offers is what will clear the market for capacity. When that happens, the entire market will be paid that price based on environmental investment. And so what does that mean for making regulatory decisions about generation in the future? Well, one is that a lot of the environmental regulations build in various reasons for delaying an investment. So let's say you required a coal plant to have a scrubber, and a year from now, the coal plant comes to a regulator and says, well, we'd like to get an extension on installing that scrubber. And when we do that, that'll save a lot of cost because we can defer it a couple of years. Well, one thing that everyone should be aware of is that the cost of that scrubber has already been built into the market price for capacity. And so it's not going to spare the public that cost. In fact, that cost is going to be spread across the entire market. That's an appropriate economic signal, but it's something to be aware of if someone is asking for an extension and claims there's going to be some public cost benefit to getting that extension. There will not necessarily be that public cost benefit because the capacity price will already be determined. And so another thing to consider too is uncertainty, and that is if we're not certain we're going to go forward with a regulation, it's really not, there is a cost associated with promulgating regulation, and then that looks very draconian, and then pulling back and making it less draconian. If that draconian regulation is already built into the price, it's essentially too late. And so that's not a statement on what the substance of the regulation should be. It is a statement on the importance of being very sensitive to the impacts on prices when we communicate to companies what they should expect the compliance costs will be in the future. This is an example of some of the EP regulations that are being considered. One in the first panel was covered, and that is the cross-state air pollution rule. That really is going to raise cost. It's more associated with energy because it's about runtime and pollution, less applicable to the capacity market, and so less critical over the next few years. One that I would say is more important right now is the mercury air toxic standards. As you can see, we don't need to worry about those because they're not going to be applicable until 2015, but we do have to worry because 2015, that is the delivery year that we're procuring this May. So the cost of compliance, and basically right now, to comply with MATS, you can work out with your regulator various behavioral changes. In 2015, it's going to require, if you want to build a new unit or refurbish it, you're going to have to meet maximum available control technology. That's a high standard. It basically means, if you want to do an upgrade, you need to put in state-of-the-art equipment. That's expensive. The cost of putting in state-of-the-art equipment for some units that may well set the clearing price in RPM this May is being considered right now. And then I added two other rules. Neither of these are really drivers because the greenhouse gas tailing rule doesn't have enough specifics yet to really be driving investments, but it does have people looking. When you're looking at a plant, particularly a new investment, or an investment in a scrubber that is intended to extend the life, say, of a mid-merit coal unit 10 years, these are things that raise uncertainty and do factor into retirement decisions and what the makeup of our fleet will look like. And finally, there's the NESHAP RICE, or the National Emission Standards Hazardous Air Pollutant Reciprocating Internal Combustion Engine Rule. That applies more to smaller units. It's more about behind-the-meter generation that's used in support of demand response. That has an impact on the markets that's increasing as reliance on demand response increases. But I would say that the critical regulation right now is MATS. And then I think I would just refer you to our website, to our State of the Market report, which goes into a lot of what I've been discussing in a lot more detail. And I'm just about out of time that I was going to talk a little bit about New Jersey heat, but I don't want to put us behind schedule if that's. All right, we'll just show an example of a state regulation. And I can't really get the hang of it. And the ways in which you can have different regulators coming apart in different ways. New Jersey is part of a larger state consortium that has looked at the problem from a different way than most of the federal regulations. And what they're looking at in this high energy demand day rule is pollution that comes from units that typically run on high energy demand days. The problem, particularly in a place with a concentration of population like New Jersey, is that on these hot days you will have aggregated ozone levels. If everything is turned on, providing the power needs that on that peak day, you're going to have a lot of ozone from the generators. And that creates health issues, serious health issues. And, but unlike the other rules, which mainly are talking about converting fossil fuels into energy and the pollutants that result from that, this is about specific timing. And it just so happens that peak days, these are the same days that the plants that are seldom dispatched might get dispatched or might need to hang around in order to potentially be dispatched, as we were discussing earlier. And so, now none of these units really are eligible to service capacity resources. And so that means that they're going to be forced into retirement as they are going to be forced into retirement. And this goes into, basically we're talking about phase 2, which also goes into place in 2015. So the owners of these units all know that come this May, their units are not going to be eligible to service capacity resources. And Governor Christie has already announced there's not going to be an extension to the 2015 deadline. So there are a significant portion of capacity in New Jersey is now, and that is one of the more constrained high-price capacity areas. Is now looking at this and deciding whether to retire, and I think that's a good example of state regulation covering a different area, a different problem, and arguably more specific to New Jersey, and how that also is having an impact on the overall makeup of the PJM fleet. And so that concludes the formal presentation. I'll be happy to take your questions later.
Questions? Okay. Professor Androstri. What?
Can I ask just a question
Sure.
about your company? I wasn't clear where you guys fit in the market. I saw you worked at PJM before, now you work at Monitoring Analytics.
Right.
And you supplied this analysis with who essentially pays for your valuable service. I was curious where you fit.
Sure. In 2005, I showed up at PJM. I'd always been interested since I was working in the energy industry in RTOs and in regulation through competition, and the RTOs are very central to that. And I joined the legal counsel staff at PJM, and they assigned me to the market monitoring unit. And there we had over 3 years working at PJM, very important transitional time. There was some controversy over the independence of market monitoring, and that ultimately resulted in 2008 of the market monitoring unit being spun off as a separate institution. And so from that vantage point, continuing as a market monitor. And I determined to go with it because I can say I find a great deal of fulfillment in the market monitoring function. I'm very interested in regulation through competition and seeing it work. And the market monitor has a unique opportunity to really try to promote the most competitive and efficient market design without necessarily having to compromise that position to satisfy the various interests that are involved in the stakeholder process. And so, in some ways, we get to play a role that attempts to bridge. If it weren't for the presence of an entity with that interest, the stakeholder process would look too much like a lot of horse trading. When we start this conversation, I want to get a little bit more at the role of consumer advocates in that stakeholder process, but I'll set that aside. As far as the question of funding, PJM receives its funding from an adder to everyone's rate, so it's a small piece of what everyone pays, what the wholesale rate is that gets translated ultimately into a retail bill. And an even smaller piece of that covers the cost of market monitoring. It also covers the cost of enabling the state commissions that are in that PJM footprint from having a representative in the stakeholder process too, in order to keep an eye on it, and to try to coordinate with states. And also the states tend to be probably the most effective advocate from the consumer and load side interest in that process right now.
Can I ask a super quick question?
Sure.
What's the average rate of return for a typical merchant coal generator in PJM?
What is the average rate of return? I think that is really going to depend on the economics of the specific plant. There aren't any new ones. And so...
and for a 30-year-old pulverized merchant plant?
Yeah, I couldn't give you a number, but what I can say is that many of the larger plants, larger scale plants, continue to be profitable. And they continue to be profitable because they run, they serve as a base load unit, they get paid energy all the time, they get their capacity piece, and they're paid for. And in fact, that's one of the controversies that surrounds the movement of regulation to competition, is that in the past they were paid for by ratepayers. And now they get a fairly substantial return through the competitive markets.
So what's a fairly substantial return? 20%? 30%?
I couldn't give you a number.
Can we go ahead with the next speaker?
Sure, sorry.
Answer these questions at the end.
Good afternoon. I'm Jamie Van Ostring. Maybe I take a minute to maybe try to tie some of these things together that we've been talking about. First, I guess I'm going to disagree with Bill Reisinger about whether or not environmental costs should be considered by state PUCs. I think they should, and I'm going to show you how I think they shouldn't. And we need to start doing it in Virginia. We need to start doing it in West Virginia. Two, I really appreciate the comments of Rose McKinney James. I know she said she was on the board of directors of the Energy Foundation. And my 3 years before I came to West Virginia, I was the head of the PACE Energy and Climate Center in New York, where I was one of those new voices advocating clean energy, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and from the New York PSC. And we did it with the support of a lot of money from the Energy Foundation. And so, Rose, would appreciate your efforts on that behalf. And about Tyson's reference to the Cantwell-Collins bill, which I thought, you know, the elegant thing about it was only like 19 or 20 pages, as I recall, whereas Wax and Markey was about 900 pages. And it'd be interesting to hear what Jeff has to say about, you know, not just the capacity markets, but the energy markets, because what Tyson was talking about is this market clearing price, and the fact that in these restructured markets, the price is not set in relation to cost. It's set in relation to a market clearing price, and that market clearing price, everybody gets that market clearing price. When I was at PACE, we participated as the environmental representative on the management committee of the New York ISO, and if that market clearing price is set by reference to a fossil fired unit like coal or natural gas, it's going to include any increment for a price on carbon, and everybody gets that price. So you want to talk about what kind of return a clean energy plant like the Entergy Indian Point plant on Hudson River made $982 million for Entergy in 2010, which represented 80% return on equity. So if you own a non-fossil burning plant and you're in a restructured market, and that market clearing price is set by reference to a much more expensive unit than yours, you're making a lot of money. And that's sort of the disconnect with the restructured markets and the sort of traditional rate of return markets where prices are actually set by reference to cost. It's complicated. Let me see. So I just want to talk about how I think a clean energy agenda can be advanced in utility regulatory proceedings. And 4 things in particular: integrated resource planning, energy efficiency and demand response, renewable and clean energy resources, and I think what Tyson was talking about, sort of the new paradigm. We need to move to a different model. We need to move to a distributed generation model. We need to get away from this model where we're building large centralized generating plants, incurring lots of money to move lots of power over long distances and losing money in transmission line losses and a decreasing reliable system. I think the cornerstone for advancing clean energy agenda is the integrated resource planning process. You've got to have utilities engage in a process of evaluating all of their resource options, including demand side, energy efficiency, demand response on the same playing field as supply side resources. So basically, you're using a consistent method for calculating cost effectiveness. You're going to pay the amount to acquire energy efficiency and conservation based on the cost you're going to avoid by not having to build that generating unit. It's pretty basic stuff. You'd be surprised the number of states in this country that don't follow it, including Virginia and West Virginia. This is from a client I used to have. I represented investor-owned utilities in the Northwest for 22 years before I moved into academia. This is one of my clients, Puget Sound Energy. This represents this is from the 2011 Integrated Resource Plan, and those lines above show their forecasted loads. These are all the customers they're going to have to serve, and there's 3 variations on that line depending upon high forecast, medium, low forecast, low load forecast. And then those stacks on the bottom represent their existing resources, and then the fact that they're stepping down means you might have older plants that are retiring, you might have long-term contracts that are expiring. And that gap is what needs to be filled. And the integrated resource planning process is, okay, we have this gap of 2,000 megawatts in 2021. What are we going to use to fill that gap? Then you look at your various options for filling that gap. You can, in Puget, in the case of Puget, they're acquiring a lot of wind resources. They're building solar farms. They're expanding their hydro projects. but they're also investing heavily in energy efficiency. And if it turns out through the integrated resource planning process that energy efficiency is the cheapest way to fill that gap, then they're obligated to pursue that. Because the whole point of the integrated resource planning process, it's least cost planning. You're gonna adopt a portfolio of resources that results in the lowest present value revenue requirement to your customers. You're trying to follow a path that's going to hold costs down. When you turn around, you use that when you evaluate the prudence of the utility's actions and subsequent rate proceedings. So it's going to have teeth. If a utility that departs from a least cost path, then they're going to be subject to a disallowance in a rate proceeding. And basically, it's a portfolio options. And I look at some of the, what's going on in West Virginia right now. Appalachian Power is going to be coming in with a 40% rate increase within months. They're now trying to run a bill in the West Virginia legislature to securitize that and basically say, oh, we're going to spread it out over 5-10 years, and then we're going to issue bonds to finance the deferral of those costs. And to me, if Appalachian Power 10 years ago had engaged in a rigorous integrated resource planning process, we wouldn't find ourselves there, because they're 97% dependent upon coal, because they never looked at any alternatives. They never ran scenarios and say, gee, what if coal doubles in 10 years like it has? And we didn't look at the possibility of investing in energy efficiency, maybe actually having the utility roll out energy efficiency programs and allow their customers to hold down their bills by investing in energy efficiency. These utilities don't do it in West Virginia because there's no rigorous integrated resource planning process, and there needs to be. And then the other thing I think I want to make, and there's a particular response to Will Reisinger's point, sort of what the role of the Attorney General and what the states can do. There was no need to have express statutory authority to engage in integrated resource planning. The Commission can just say, we consider it to be prudent utility practice to engage in integrated resource planning as a matter of burden of proof. If you want to come in here and try to recover a cost for a new generating unit, and you can't demonstrate to us that that's the least long-term cost for your customers, we're not going to allow you to recover that cost in rates. That's just basic rate making. You have a broad authority to set just and reasonable rates. The IRP process can be required by rule or order. Practice law in Washington, we did it by a commission rule. In Oregon, we did it by a commission order. You just direct utilities engaged in integrated resource planning. And there's no need for a statutory authority, no need for the legislature to be involved. It's part of the rate making process. And just as I said, it's part of the burden of proof that you need the utilities to show that they acquire down a particular path to acquire a resource through the integrated resource planning process. So how does energy efficiency fit in that? Well, as I mentioned before, the IRP process should define the value of energy efficiency and demand response. That by deciding how much you're going to pay for energy efficiency and how much you're going to invest in demand response programs, you're doing that by reference to the power costs you're going to avoid by not having to build new generation. And so utility determines when it designs its energy efficiency programs, if utilities actually did that in West Virginia, you would actually determine how much you're going to pay to acquire energy efficiency, and based on the cost you're going to avoid on the supply side. And that should produce the correct price signal, because you want to be sending the right price signals to consumers as to what we're going to pay you to invest in energy efficiency and demand response. And I think the IRP process should also be sophisticated enough to consider what I would call the other costs. For one thing, energy efficiency, I think has less risk when compared to some supply side options, and a rigorous IRP process should take that into account. I think a rigorous IRP process should also look at the fact you're not going to have to build additional transmission and distribution infrastructure. You're not going to have to build more transmission lines, substation, poles and wires to move power long distance, because you're not having to move the power. You're investing in energy efficiency and you're avoiding that. A rigorous IRP process to look at the fact that energy efficiency is going to it's going to produce reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And again, I think it's a matter of burden of proof. It's not rocket science. This is what utilities come in. And if you depart from a least cost path, then you're going to potentially have a risk of a disallowance. We're not going to let you recover that huge rate increase you're asking for, because we determined you didn't follow the least cost plan. How does that fit for renewable resources? As commonly the renewable resources are defined as wind, solar, biomass, geothermal, small-scale hydro. And I think more recently we've seen resources defined as clean energy resources. So we're going to throw nuclear in there and fossil fuel with carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS. Those are all technically clean energy resources, but more commonly we're looking at renewable energy resources, like I'm referred to the renewable portfolio standards, for example. But the IRP process should consider all costs and risks associated with these competing resource options. And that's where I take issue with Will's talk about whether or not we could take it into consideration, because it's how you define cost. Do you look at just accounting cost, do you look at dollars and cents cost, or do you look at environmental cost? And I think a good IRP process is what's been done in the Northwest. We've been putting environmental adders on carbon, acid rain, particulate matter since 1989 in the Northwest. You put a price on carbon, you build those things, you build those environmental impacts into your IRP process. So when a utility is looking at building a coal plant versus a natural gas plant versus wind or solar, you're reflecting all the costs of that fossil fuel fired generation, not just the economic costs. It's how you define costs. And regulators can take into account environmental impacts if they choose to. Cost does not mean dollar and cents costs as measured by accountants. It can include social costs, it can include environmental impacts. It's how you define costs, and commissions have tremendous deference, tremendous discretion in how they define costs, and a court will never overturn. As long as you have a bill of record to show costs, we define costs to mean this, that decision is going to be very difficult to overturn on appeal. So commissions can do a lot, because the power to set just and reasonable rates, and the power to regulate in the public interest gives them tremendous authority when they're supervising utilities. And I think the price on carbon, I think it's not so much of a stretch. I think at some point, integrated resource planning is going to include a life cycle greenhouse gas analysis. We're not going to look at just the CO2 that's emitted while the plant is generating. We're going to look at the CO2 over the entire life cycle. So when we say nuclear doesn't produce any CO2, that's true when it's generating electricity, but it does produce CO2 when you're building a nuclear plant, when you're processing the uranium, and when you're decommissioning a nuclear plant. The life cycle analysis would take that all into account, and it's not too much of a stretch to think IRPs, a rigorous IRP process down the road, will include this life cycle greenhouse gas analysis. Same thing with comparative risk profiles, and I think the avoided cost, including T&D infrastructure costs, could also be taken into account. And I think the same thing in terms of, when Tyson was talking about this new paradigm, distributed generation, I think an integrated resource planning can also take into account some of the advantages of distributed generation. For example, avoided T&D infrastructure costs. There was a good decision out of California from FERC involving the California feed-in tariff, which gave preferences to high efficiency cogen. And one of the things that California wanted to take into account was the fact that if you build the generation closer to where the loads are, you're going to have to invest less in transmission and distribution infrastructure. You're going to avoid the 7 to 9% of electricity that gets lost moving it from point A to point B. You're going to benefit from increased reliability of the distribution system. So a rigorous IRP process should be able to take into account the fact that distributed generation has a lot of advantages over this central model where we build coal plants that have about 35 to 40% efficiency, as opposed to like high efficiency combined heat and power, they can have about 75 to 80% efficiency. And I also think in these days that we're talking about energy security, you also have a greater resiliency of the utility grid. And you're going to have more reliability of the utility grid because you're going to have the power spread out throughout the utility service territory rather than just landing in one particular place with a lot of transmission lines to move it. And one of the things I did when I was at the Pace Energy and Climate Center was raise this issue of distributed generation as a matter of utility burden of proof in retail rate proceedings. We intervened in the Con Edison rate case. They had an $800 million rate increase request. 20% of that was driven by their need to invest in more transmission and distribution, to upgrade their power lines, build more substations. And we said, we think you need to demonstrate as a matter of burden of proof that you consider distributed generation as an alternative to investing in T&D infrastructure. That we don't think you should all get a pass for just investing in these things to move more power. Maybe a cheaper route for your customers, which is what the commission should be doing, is making sure that utilities are not spending more than they have to. You have a matter of burden of proof. You need to demonstrate that you consider investing in distributed generation as an alternative to investing that money in more T&D infrastructure. So that's another way that you can get at it. You don't need a statute to do this. There's nothing creative here. This is a matter of utility. Before it can recover those costs and rates, it has a burden to demonstrate that those costs were reasonably incurred and necessary. And that gives interveners, that gives these new voices that Rose is talking about, an opportunity to go after them and say, think differently about distributed generation. So basically, conclusions, that the existing regulatory framework does provide a lot of options to integrate environmental issues in electric utility rate proceedings. We need to think creatively. There's a lot of burdens on utilities in terms of what they have to show in order to be able to cover these higher costs and rates. Commissions have tremendous latitude in setting just and reasonable rates, regulating in the public interest, and that gives interveners the chance to build a record that really challenges utilities to think differently and think about the sort of the clean energy agenda that has reduced environmental impacts and probably lower revenue requirement, lower rates for customers in the future. So with that, thanks.
I just want to respond real quickly to Professor Van Nostrand. I appreciate your comments that you believe that the Commission should consider environmental costs and environmental impacts when making its decision. It's just the problem is that there's not very much in the Code of Virginia that allows the Commission to base a decision on environmental costs or environmental impacts. And in Virginia, we do have an IRP law, so that the utilities do have to engage in an IRP process, but under the statute, they don't have to consider environmental impacts. And I think every year for the last couple of years, there's been a bill in the General Assembly that would put environmental impacts, public health impacts into the law, make it part of the criteria that the utility has to go through before an IRP gets approved. And those bills keep failing in the General Assembly. So I think it's a little unreasonable to expect the Commission to go out on a limb and try to make policy when the General Assembly has repeatedly decided not to make that policy. But I certainly do appreciate and understand your point there. But in Virginia, I think have to defend the Commission a little bit.
My experience is based on the Northwest, where there's no IRP statute. The Commission adopted a rule in Washington and an order in Oregon. It just says when we set just and reasonable rates, we're going to require utilities to go through an integrated resource planning process. That process is going to include costs, and costs are going to include environmental impacts. I don't think you need a statute, and the commissions can do it if they want to. I understand why they might not want to, particularly in certain parts of the country that are dependent on fossil fuels. But the Commission certainly has the authority to do it, and I wish it would.
I certainly think the Commission would be criticized by some as making policy that is more properly done by the General Assembly if they did do what you're proposing.
Well, you know what, to weigh in on this, I'm not sure you need an IRP. I mean, I think one way you could use your existing authorization, which is all really cost-based, is to say to a potential developer to look at the reference market price. I mean, essentially the capacity market PJM operates as a region-wide IRP. And for reasons I was discussing, it builds into it environmental costs because those are exactly the costs people are looking towards when they are considering how they're going to comply with the regulations even 3 years out. And so if someone were to come in with a coal plant or any other kind of plant what they're basically asking is to prove this in a rate that's going to go to ratepayers. Ratepayers will take all the risk. A standard reference might be, well, what would happen in the market if you would come up to us with this coal plant? It looks like you would be seriously out of the money with this coal plant. We don't care why. It happens, part of that is the state spread, a big part of it is environmental regulation compliance. But is it prudent to build a plant that the market is sending a strong signal to the entire region, for which Virginia is interconnected? It says don't build this, and other plants there is a strong incentive saying do build this. And as far as things like renewables, you could look at the REX markets, look at the prices there. Those are sending a strong signal in places that are looking to meet these portfolio standards do build this, and that's a cost. It's not it doesn't necessarily require you to get into looking at the environmental substance, but really just the basic cost improvements issues that we've always dealt with.
As I said when we started, after the speakers finished, we would ask Ms. Urquhart to comment or question.
Yeah, a lot has been said here. I guess I should start with a disclaimer, which is a little bit. The views that I might be express here are not necessarily those of the FERC. But I guess to start, you know, I graduated from this law school in 1996, and I was in private practice for about 10 years. 8 of those were with a large New York-based white shoe firm doing a lot of cutting-edge cross-border utility transactions and private equity deals in the utility industry. And then I went to FERC in 2005 when EPAC 2005 was enacted. And we were doing all these regulations. I thought that would be really interesting, and it has been. But in the recent few years, some really interesting things are still coming before FERC that FERC is grappling with. And I think as Rose indicated, FERC is really stepping up to the plate on a lot of these issues. It does have some constraints. The statute it works with that governs its jurisdiction basically was written in 1935, and the 2 provisions that really pertain mainly to its jurisdiction are Section 201 and Sections 205 and 206. And you may know that 201 provides the FERC jurisdiction over the sale of electricity and the providers of transmission service, and everything else is reserved to the states. A lot of the new technologies, demand response, energy efficiency, it's not really clear how some of those services and products fit within the statute. And that's what makes life as an attorney at FERC very interesting these days, because it's really having to work with a sort of an antiquated statute and trying to figure out what FERC can do, how it can do it under its existing legislation. So, and again, as Rose pointed out, we have done a lot, embarked on a lot of initiatives. Our chairman is very interested in these issues and has been a real leader, I would say, in this area. So, I mean, I guess I do have some questions, or at least one question for Rose initially, and I'd like to know what your thoughts are as to how is FERC, what more do you think FERC can do with what it has under its statute?
Well, recognizing the limitations that you've identified, what we already see is a willingness to step out and above to have a broader conversation. Professor, I think your point is very well taken. As a member of a regulatory body, individually, you have the opportunity to express an opinion for your colleagues to consider. And to the extent that the FERC can keep this conversation going, while other advocacy groups are actively educating and informing the consuming public, it seems to me that there will be some convergence and some movement forward. It's really important, from my perspective, that FERC continue to be aggressively involved in the leadership and let the states figure out the details, if that makes sense. Even if you feel that you have limitations, you may need some new commissioners. I'm just saying.
Well, I'm just saying we've got a law right here that the commission is bound by.
Well, I think there are some challenges that FERC has because, like energy efficiency, demand response, some of the things that Chairman Wellinghoff is pushing are largely seen as being state issues. I mean, energy efficiency, and I think the chairman is finding opportunities to push these ISOs, the regional transmission organizations, independent system operators, for example, in the capacity markets, and to make sure the curtailment service providers, which is a form of demand response, make sure they're getting accurate price signals. I think they're pushing as far as they can, but they certainly have sort of jurisdictional limitations on how far they can push that, because pretty soon the states are going to get upset, the retail utilities are going to be upset that FERC is now sort of playing in their sandbox. And so I think the chairman and FERC are going pretty far, and there's just a lot of federal-state tensions on these issues, and I think they're going far as much as they can through the ISOs and through the RTOs.
And building on that, I'd like to see FERC impose more requirements on these regional transmission organizations to vastly increase the voting representation for those representing the public interest and other key stakeholders. Right now, it's fair to say that the voting rights within these private organizations are dominated by the power generators. And it's kind of like a Russian election. You know what the outcome is going to be. I think it's critical to have not only a much larger mandated consumer voice, but also more environmental groups, more community groups, so that the decisions being made about our energy infrastructure aren't just those on the supply side, they're on the demand side as well. And I think that'll help the governance of these truly reflect all stakeholders involved.
Right. So I guess you sort of viewed in the organized market arena the fact that FERC regulates those organized markets pervasively, and there have been a number of court decisions that have affirmed our ability to regulate capacity, for instance. Order 719, you may be familiar with that, where the Commission adopted an opt-in, opt-out policy with respect to demand response. So anyway, I think it sort of views, I think the Commission views that has a view that there are still some limitations with respect to its activities in an organized market. But I guess to the extent you're suggesting more consumer representation in these markets.
And environmental. I mean, I think expanding who the stakeholders are in our electricity system beyond just power sellers.
You're giving me a lot of points. I would like to weigh in and say that. One will be on the stakeholder process. The current stakeholder, it's not the voting structure. The voting structure in the RTOs essentially gives the way it's set up in PJM, and then I'm not commenting on the others, but only PJM. Essentially a veto over load interests over almost anything that the organization will want to do. The problem is really not and for that reason there is a movement afoot among the powers that be to try to change that governance structure to eliminate that ability. And that is something that, with a lot of nervousness, I've been watching, but that hasn't happened yet. The problem is that the consumer interests, despite the opportunity to be there, are not. And that is even more true as you go down into the very technical committees like, say, Black Start Service. Black Start Service is basically the service that makes sure that if the whole grid went dark, we would have generating capability to restart the grid and get everything going again. It's been cheap. It's about to get a lot more expensive as a result of certain new security-based regulation requirements. I covered that committee. It's entirely staffed by people who provide Black Start Service. And so while I object to various things that they bring up as being inefficient, I'm not there to represent necessarily the consumer interest. My role is to represent efficiency. When you're in a room where only one side of the debate is happening, that often means that the missing piece of the debate is in fact the consumer interest. But that's not really my role.
And so, that's often because of the cost involved in participation.
It is because
it costs a lot of staff time, travel time that is beyond the budgets of most public interest organizations.
Right. And so you've mentioned having an office of the consumer advocate at FERC, and I think you had also mentioned consumer advocate participation. And I don't think that it's enough to be at FERC, because FERC has a huge job, because right now they are regulating a million different market designs. And that is, every RTO has its own complicated structure. And then half the country isn't even in an organized market. Almost none of this discussion of renewables, demand response even applies there. It's all the old cost of service method. And so, but even when you just go to the organized markets, having a consumer advocate, what that really means is that after the stakeholder process has approved a market rule that actually heavily favors one interest, but gets the stamp of approval of a stakeholder consensus, and then gets filed under Section 205, which accords enormous deference to the public utility making the filing. They don't have to show that their approach is the best, the most efficient. All they have to show is it falls within a very broad zone of just and reasonableness. The FERC receives this, it says, this is the filing, I just need to see what it's just and reasonable. I can't consider whether it's really the best, even if the market monitor has approved here, giving a better way. That's the standard, isn't that, what's best, it's just and reasonable. And also, look, the stakeholder process, which reflects, everyone with a stake in the PJM, they all basically agreed, they all voted for it. And so that puts an enormous weight on FERC to say, oh no, change it all. we're going to do something different. You haven't met your burden. And even if there were a consumer advocate there to weigh in at that time, it might be too late. What you really need to have is an office of the consumer advocate at PJM.
I'm not going to disagree with that. I like this suggestion very much.
Virginia needs to send, another delegation to Philadelphia for the environment, the energy government. And it may not be just Virginia. The way the state commissions have done it, meaning the VSCC and and its counterparts in the other PJM states, what they did is they created something called the Organization of PJM States. And that body meets regularly, and it has a permanent representative that does attend PJM meetings. They're not enough to cover it all. And our interest isn't exactly as purely for the consumer as consumer advocate might be. But you really need to have a comparable organization of the state advocates that are at PJM also have representatives at meetings. And in fact, there was a proposal for such an advocate that will be funded through a rate mechanism similar to the one that funds OPSI, similar to the ones that funds us, that would allow to have a representative and a very small staff that would take on an enormous job, and one I should say could very quickly pay for itself, many times over for the consumers who would ultimately bear that charge. It's the one charge that the cost benefits were very much in favor of. But not surprisingly, it was shot down by the people in the stakeholder process who didn't see the need for it.
Same thing happened in New York.
And I should say that did not just include the suppliers. It also, it's not necessarily that PJM has no representation from load. It has selected participation from load. Certain individual companies with their own interests are there, and they are basically arguing for the load perspective, but they also have their own interests. And so, when the horse trading begins, whose interest do you think ultimately gets met, and whose interest do you think gets thrown under the bus? You need to have the state advocate there that represents the broad collective, and individual companies sort of as stand-ins don't quite cut it. And I can understand why FERC was reluctant to simply impose it when it had the opportunity, but it's something that I think that should be continually pressed for. And should that happen, I don't know if you would really need, FERC already has a litigation wing that does a good job. I think if you were to have adequate representation that would really get into the details and the PJM market design, you could get very satisfactory results. And that for the first time, you could really exploit the opportunity that you have. I mean, the transmission owners and generation owners complain endlessly about how is it our customers suddenly sit on the board of the organization that sets up the market. My response is, how is it that you don't? How is it they're not here? But there needs to be more pushback. There needs to be more effort to seize that opportunity and to be there. Not just the temptation to go to FERC or to go to the senior committees at PJM. No, you have to go all the way down to the technical committees where the rules originate if you really want to protect the interests of load in the market design.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Just one quick comment on that. As someone who's been involved in administrative proceedings for 40 plus years, gives away my age, very complex issues, that there is, and I'm not pointing the finger at you, but that there is a propensity or sort of strategy on the part of antis not to participate fully in the proceedings because they're not particularly interested in having their proposals and ideas weighed on the merits they may lose. It's much easier and more productive to allow something to go forward, get it fully in place, and then start raising the issue of why you weren't permitted to participate, etc. Now, I'd like to know here if we have any questions from the audience here to the panel.
I don't have a question, but I just want to say for the record, I couldn't disagree with you more on your last comment.
Well, I'll be more than happy to discuss that with you.
If I could just briefly respond. I mean, the issue, as I said earlier, is the cost involved of participating significantly in technical and legal proceedings when you are not compensated for doing so. If you are a utility in the state regulatory process, ratepayers are essentially covering your participation. If public citizen seeks to intervene as a private party, we are responsible for covering 100% of those legal and technical costs associated with participating. I don't know how familiar you are with budgets of public interest firms, but many are extremely small and limited. The opportunities to hire the technical staff, the lawyers at the white shoe firms that specialize in these areas is extraordinarily expensive, and funders are very reluctant to finance that level of activity. Now, the state of California has an intervenor funding statute for its Public Utility Commission that does indeed compensate those that are operating in the public interest to intervene. And actually, the Federal Power Act, as part of the 1978 PURPA amendments, includes a section that Chairman Wellinghoff wasn't even aware of until I brought it to his attention, that there is an Office of Public Participation within the Federal Power Act that was authorized by Congress but never financed, that includes the potential for intervenor funding assistance to those entities operating in the public interest to intervene before FERC. That, of course, has never been financed. But the issue is not one that we enjoy making trouble from the outside because it's more convenient to do so. It's one of simple economics, in my humble opinion.
And let me add it at the state level, at least in my experience until recently, to some degree, the absence of the voice that I'm talking about was a function of internal intervenor rules. The statutes in Nevada have recently been changed to allow for broader participation, to give the commission the discretion to do more. And I know I made a very unflattering comment because I want to make sure that everybody understands that the unflattering comment was maybe you need more new commissioners. When I say that, the thought was it's a very difficult job. It's probably the hardest work I've ever done because the burdens are so great. The challenge of just getting through the information and the filings and it's a weighty job. And so it is easy, I think, to work within the lines and not push. My point is, my interpretation of a statute may be different than a colleague's. And until we have that conversation, and until we have people who are willing to have the conversation and not necessarily take the safe road, we don't achieve what I would like to see us achieve going forward.
A couple of you talked about moving the electricity system away from baseload centralized generation towards decentralized generation. Can you have reliability of service for the kind of society that we have if you move away from baseload and towards decentralized?
I think in the year 2012, there are going to be serious challenges to that, the larger scale that you go on a decentralized system. But as technologies continue to improve, as we continue to develop storage technologies, and if we make the concrete investments in a smaller scale grid, I think it is absolutely possible, and it's going to become essential to future reliability. I think that the opportunities to build the large-scale transmission projects are going to be severely limited by the role that NIMBYism will play. And I know that that's a term that has a negative connotation. I happen to like when citizens have the constitutional right to have a say in what goes on in their communities. I think it's a pretty important American tradition, and there's a lot of folks in the energy industry that would like to see that go away, and I think that that would be a serious problem. And so I just think that the issues involved with building these large-scale projects, I don't think they're going to come online because of the years of litigation involved with handling everyone's due process rights. So there are some challenges. There is no easy path. But I think that there's a number of communities that are already moving to small-scale sustainable systems. In Austin, Texas, there's another one in Illinois. There's a new development in Philadelphia that are cost-effective and reliable, small-scale, renewable anchored systems.
I want to try out a hypothesis.
reaction. The problem that we're talking about in Virginia specifically is not one that's limited to Virginia. Lots of public utility commissions think about short-term price impacts and nothing much more. And that's a problem that energy generators and more progressive utilities run into all the time. They say that the public utility commissions are the problem. And I'm wondering if part of it is that this culture within public utility commissions has come up through the years because when you were dealing with fossil fuel generation, you could not, there was no point in asking yourself, what's the fuel price 20 years from now? Because it didn't matter. You were stuck with whatever your fuel was and whatever happened to pricing. And it's very different now. We've got an opportunity with renewable energy to lock in prices for 20, 30 years, the price of the wind, the life of the wind farm or your solar generation. So if you were coming at it fresh now, you might think the public interest is served by looking at what are going to be your total prices over 30 years. But that's contrary to the practice and the culture that has been very short-term pricing. And that's just a hypothesis, and I'd be curious about your reactions.
To me, I think integrated resource planning is intended to address that. And whether or not the commission, most commissioners have 6-year terms, they're staggered terms, and they're supposed to be an independent body. So the governor can't come in and replace all the commissioners. Their staggered terms are supposed to provide some continuity. But I think the integrated resource planning process is supposed to drive the utility's business decisions. And so it's going to force the utility to engage in this 20-year planning effort. It's going to have to look at these possible environmental costs and have to look at various scenarios of high gas prices, low gas prices, high coal prices, low coal prices. I think the integrated resource process helps in that. But I agree, commissioners can take a very short-term view. But that's why I think the IRP process is really the cornerstone to have all these things taken into account, and it needs to be rigorous, it needs to be stakeholder involvement, and the commission needs to take a very serious look at it. And there needs to be consequences in rate proceedings if utilities don't follow what the integrated resource plan suggests that they do.
I mean, I agree they are too.
Excuse me if I could. We have run considerably over our time, and what I'd like to suggest is that we close up shop here at the panel, but I'm sure members of the panel will be more than happy to discuss these after we finish during the break. So please join with me in thanking the members of the panel.